In the family where I grew up, no blood was ever shed. And there's a good reason for that. My parents were extraordinarily protective of our physical bodies. I never broke a bone. I never went to the emergency room, and I think there's a strong possibility that I went through my entire childhood with our family never having to buy a second replacement box of Band-Aids. My father, sometimes at the beach, stood over me and waved away the mosquitoes. But every night in our family, my father climbed the stairs to our attic and took out the vodka. And then he began to drink and paint and drink and paint. And sometimes very late in the night, he summoned me to his attic studio. And surrounded by very beautiful lyrical landscapes of the British Columbia countryside that he had inhabited in his youth when he painted in the daytime hours, he reminded me the story I knew very well, that though I had no question that he adored me, the life of an artist was sacrificed for the life of a parent. Well, it was probably no big surprise that I did make a mission to live the life that had eluded my parents, and the life of a certain amount of freedom of creative expression came with surprising swiftness and ease for me. But for me, the most elusive goal was to be a part of a family where sorrow and disappointment were absent. And it seemed to me, upon meditation on this question, that my best shot at being part of a happy family and having happy relatives was to give birth to them. So I married quite young, age 23, and married an artist. And although in the years that followed, I think both of us came to realize the many ways that we were very different types of people, we did share a deep and passionate conviction that there might be no more thrilling and exciting creative pursuit than to have and raise children, and we got right to it. After my daughter Audrey was born, the first of my 3 children, I never at all indulged in the kind of, or felt remotely tempted to the kind of physical protectiveness that I had experienced at the hands of my parents. I was very happy to let toddlers cough over my baby and carry her around kind of casually. And in fact, I might even have been called a negligent mother, because I believed that the greatest danger to my child was not likely to be the physical kind. And what I wanted desperately to spare her was emotional pain and the disappointment of broken dreams. And so, in the interest of that, I became increasingly fanatical about protecting my daughter's magical life and perfect childhood. And we were going to do that if it killed us. Well, one of the first things that I felt was necessary for a perfect childhood was a sibling. And actually, I think that my husband would have come to that conclusion at some point on his own, but not fast enough to suit me. And so we engaged in the first of our many increasingly painful battles over the having of a baby. And eventually, my son Charlie was born, and 2 years after that, our son Willie. And there was, I almost felt, although I was working officially full-time as a writer during those years, my writing life almost seemed like a hobby compared to my real endeavor, which was to make a wonderful, exciting, thrilling childhood for my children where no disappointment or pain would be experienced. It was a big job, never bigger than at the holiday times, and I took holidays really seriously. And birthdays were sort of 3-day festivals that included scavenger hunts with rhyming clues and treasure hunts that went all over town and climaxed in the digging up of a treasure chest that I had spent all year looking for and assembling the objects to go inside. And Valentine's Day, where the entire month of February was turned over to making wonderful valentines and having every conceivable art supply laid out. And of course, Christmas, most of all. The Christmases of my own youth had culminated in my father's more than once throwing the Christmas tree across the room. But we were going to have a different kind of Christmas. And so we had cookie parties and gingerbread houses and caroling parties. And I don't think that I was ever particularly involved in just buying stuff, but I wanted to give my children presents that seemed as if they might really have come from Santa's workshop. And so I went to quite great lengths to do this. One year I drove 250 miles. We lived in the state of New Hampshire. I drove 250 miles to the apartment of a very strange man in Queens to purchase a ventriloquist puppet for my son Willie, and drove home that night. The year that my father died, I inherited a sum total of $500 from him, and my husband kind of had that money earmarked for snow tires, but I went off, it was December, and I could feel the compulsion coming on, and came home with a $500 dollhouse for Audrey. One year, she mentioned casually that it would be really fun to have a store mannequin, and I went all over the eastern seaboard. These were the days that predated the internet, and actually found in a going out of business store sale of a very obscure little department store in northern New Hampshire, a department store mannequin. My husband, not without some reason, no doubt, absented himself from most of my December activities and a lot of my other activities too, come to think of it. And so it was only at about midnight on Christmas Eve, on this one particular night, that he saw what I had amassed for Christmas. And he demanded that a full 50% of the presents and magical stuff that had been laid out around the tree be put away in the closet. Many tears were shed and angry words spoken that night, and I suspect, looking back, that it's distinctly possible that my children did not have a pain-free December 25th that year. One of the things that happens, of course, if you become enormously invested in the acquisition of precious, magical objects for your children is, and if in fact you are a person who might be spurting blood out of her own veins and not feel it, but who feels their pain on her nerve endings, and that was me, you go to great lengths to protect these things that you have gotten. And so I lived in fear of the loss of the things that might create disappointment. So every time a Barbie came into our house, the first thing I did was to dive for the shoes and set them aside. Not always fast enough. I one time tore our entire house apart looking for the shoe of Crystal Barbie. My sons tended to always gravitate towards the weapons of their toys, and they liked the little tiny, of course they were always tiny little weapons, and they lost the tiny weapons, and I did, anticipating this problem, I carried around in all times in my purse a selection of plastic cocktail picks, but the year that my sons got the Playmobil pirate ship, I don't know if any of you have ever seen the Playmobil pirate ship, but it's a really wonderful thing. And it had lots of rigging and little pirates and even a little parrot on the pirate ship. But my son Charlie's absolute favorite thing of the whole $85 Playmobil pirate ship was a single little golden sword. And the minute I saw him loving that sword, I worried about losing that sword. And I got to be pretty good, as a person does, does, who experiences her children's pain on her nerve endings, at trying to stave it off. And so as we were going out to our station wagon one night to drive a friend home, I actually knew to say, Charlie, hold on to that sword in the car. And we had a very long drive, and about 20 minutes into the drive, I heard this small gasp from the back of the station wagon, and he didn't have to tell me. I knew what had happened. I spent the next hour and a half circling a single mile-long stretch of highway with my high beams on. I did actually retrieve the sword. And I was not hit by the 18-wheeler that passed me on the highway, although it came very close. More and more as the years passed, I think my husband sought his solace in removing himself. And so with a certain chilling familiarity, he disappeared very often to the studio to paint, and the children and I went off on our adventures alone. And if you live in the town of Hillsborough, New Hampshire, sometimes you have to work pretty hard to find your adventures. We went to the Mack Truck Museum many a time. We went dump picking. That was one of our specialties. We bowled so often I actually got a bowling shirt. But then, and my dream of an adventure for them, we also drove long distances to go to museums. If there was any stimulating activity within a 500-mile radius, we would try really hard to get there. But my real dream was to take my children to Europe, and it seemed impossibly expensive. We didn't have a lot of money. And then I saw an ad for a weekend in London for $100 a ticket. And I felt I could swing it. So I bought tickets for the 3 children and me, and we flew to London for 3 days. We didn't really sleep. I didn't really let them because I wanted them to be sure to be having fun at all moments, all the time. And I told them that each of them could purchase one special object to remember our incredibly great time. And Charlie chose a set of juggling balls, those brightly colored leather juggling balls. And he really loved those juggling balls. And we went down into the London Tube, and he began to juggle with the juggling balls. And I knew so well the kinds of things that happened and how I would feel if they did, that I screamed out to him, "No, Charlie, don't!" But it was too late. One of the beautiful leather juggling balls fell into the pit of the London Tube, and I jumped in after it. And as I was climbing out of the pit, with Audrey standing on the edge, screaming at me, I knew I had become an insane mother. Well, that Christmas, I baked a bûche de Noël from scratch. I made all the little marzipan mushrooms. And I don't even remember what my husband and I fought about that year. I just know that the bûche de Noël with the marzipan mushrooms was pushed down the garbage disposal. In May of the next year, on Mother's Day, I got a call that my mother had been diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. And I left home to be with her for what was to be the final season of her life. And in fact, there were 2 deaths that summer, because that was also the season that my marriage ended, and probably it was time for that to happen. And though my grief over the end of my marriage was extreme, it paled beside the sorrow I felt at the prospect of having to tell our children. And the telling of our children was probably the last important thing that their father and I shared together. So we sat them down on the living room couch. Charlie, Willie, and Audrey, ages 7, 5, 11. And they sat there looking almost expectant, as if an announcement might be coming of another great adventure. But after we told them the news, they each responded in a way very like themselves. My daughter Audrey, the oldest, who knew very well by this time that I felt her pain and took it a step further, that she would spare me the feeling of the pain by not expressing it. Audrey got up from the couch with a stiff little smile and said, "I think I'll go watch Cosby now." Willie, who was 5 and never spared anybody anything, stood up and let out an animal wail that I had never heard before or since, thank God, and flung himself against the wall and said, "You mean you'll be divorced for the rest of my life?" And Charlie, our middle child, age 7, got up from the couch without saying anything and walked into the kitchen, where the table was, as usual, covered with every conceivable art supply. And he took out a piece of paper and the colored pencils, and he began to draw. And what he drew was a heart, but it wasn't the easy, automatic little hearts of our February festivals. And in fact, he drew it so painstakingly slowly, 1 centimeter at a time, as if he was drawing in blood. And then he shaded the sides so that there was almost a shadow behind the heart. And then he drew a little line as if the heart was a painting and it was hanging on a wire. And then he drew a dot right in the center of where the wire was, as if it was a painting on a wire hanging on a wall. And then my 2nd grader wrote, "Love is the best art of all," wrote for his artist father and his writer mother. Love is the best art of all. And that's when I knew the utter foolishness of ever supposing that I could protect my children from the real pain, and the folly of having tried so long. Well, 16 years have passed since that day. Many of those years my children spent transporting their belongings, always in brown paper bags. They never seemed to get around to getting real suitcases from one house to the other and eventually out into the world. And many things have happened to them since, much harder than lost Barbie shoes and swords. But here's the thing that has occurred to me, and it is a wonderful discovery, a revelation that has brought some peace, which is that although I did a lousy job of protecting them, I am, in fact, related by blood to 3 surprisingly happy and healthy individuals. I did give birth to a reasonably together family apart. And it occurred to me, too, as I looked out at them as adults over the years, that the very things I tried to protect them from, the kinds of sorrow and disappointment that every single one of us goes through, are also the things that made me who I am. And so my goal, if I were doing it again, and it's over, would no longer be to attempt to save them from loss and pain, but only to raise them to survive it.